Hi guys, I'm back with another review on the Wilson Ultra Pro 16x19, which is part of Wilson's Pro Labs collection line. I'll be making comparisons to the Wilson Ultra Pro V3, which is the 1820 version, as well as the Blade Pro and the Pro Stock H19 model. My reviews are aimed at not just providing an overview of playability, but trying to find subtle nuances that you only start to figure out once you've committed to switching rackets. My hope is to help people make more informed decisions before making their purchase, especially if you don't have the means to demo a racket. So if you enjoyed this video, please help me by clicking the like button and consider subscribing to my channel for more content, as it really helps my channel grow. Also, while making this video, I've just hit 1,000 subscribers. Thank you all for your support, and also for everyone who's patient with me as I take a lot of time to release each video. So if you do want to stay up to date with me between videos, I do have an Instagram page which I post a little bit more often, which I'll provide a link in the description. And be sure to stick to the end of the video to see the overall rating I've given to the racket. So let's get started with a recap on the Ultra Pro 16x19. The Ultra Pro is a racket that's based off a model called the H19, and like the Blade Pro and the H22, was created to compete with some of Head's most popular rackets for professional players. Current top professional players who use the H19 are Gael Monfils and Madison Keys. The Ultra Tour and the Ultra Pro V3 have already been released, and they were slightly more stiffer than the original Pro Stock version. They have an 1820 string pattern, but with today's modern style of tennis, there is a need for more free spin and power, as well as a higher launch angle to help with hitting higher over the net for safety and consistency. So Wilson introducing a more open string pattern with the 1619 model was a great change to see. Blade Pro, that came with a swing weight around 335, did not require any changes to play if you were able to handle it. However, the Ultra Pro comes in at a much lower swing weight, made for ultimate customization into your perfect setup, and must be customized to reveal and unlock its playing potential. Looking at the specs, the Ultra Pro obviously has a string pattern of 16x19, and it has 6 mains in the throat of the racket, which means that it will be slightly more open to help with spin and power. It has a stiffness rating of 64 RA unstrung, which drops to about 61 RA after it's strung. The unstrung weight is 305 grams, and it has a head size of 97 square inches. The balance point is 9 points headlight or 31.5 centimeters, and it has a beam width of 20.5 millimeters. It comes in at an average swing weight between 310 to 320. There is no officially listed average spec for swing weight, and even though the swing weight could come in lower than 310 and the range I've provided is still a bit of a variance for quality control, the racket is not going to be playing any close to its fullest potential unless you get the swing weight to at least a minimum of around 325. So having an under or over-spec'd racket in this regard, whilst unacceptable in general, is not the biggest deal breaker with this particular model like it was with the Blade Pro if it was over-spec'd. Here's a list of the strings and tensions that I was testing. I had a similar format to the Blade Pro with a stiff poly, soft poly and hybrid setup. I didn't stray too far away from my typical tension range of 48 pounds because of the slightly more open pattern to maintain some control, because with the 1820 version I was stringing between 40 to 42 pounds to open up the sweet spot. But after testing, I figured that stringing 45 to 46 pounds would have been a better option for me, as it was teetering on the edge of firmness that I preferred, and only after it broke in the strings and the tension dropped was when the racket began to feel its best. I think it's also a good idea to help open up power potential as well, trying to maximize the racket since it won't really give you any free advantages in your power shots. But overall, it was a very similar experience as the Blade Pro in terms of feel. If you go with a hybrid or soft poly, you'll begin to reveal that excellent feel. But stringing with something a bit firmer starts to be a little bit problematic for some people who are more on the sensitive side. So here are the modifications I made during the playtest. I started off with the heaviest modification first to see how I would handle it. Even though the balance and static weight were fine for me, having a higher swing weight above my preferred level to get maximum stability and power did not benefit me as the session dragged on. Simply put, to make a demanding racket even more demanding wasn't a good idea. When using the Ultra Pro, you need to stay on top of it as long as you physically can. Tiring out faster, making you late with your footwork or swing speed is not something you'll want to deal with during a match. When you use the RF97 having similar specs, even if you tire out, you can still use its mass and stiffness to hit a decent ball when you're tired, and the sweet spot is also more forgiving. But on the Ultra Pro, since you need to work that much harder on every shot with your footwork and your swing, you're going to want to maintain a healthy level of racket head speed throughout your match or training session, and slowing yourself in any way will be more difficult to deal with during a lengthy session. In my opinion, keeping the swing weight as low as you can whilst maintaining just enough stability was more beneficial to optimally utilizing the racket. A swing weight past what was minimally necessary had diminishing returns for me, as you'll find that you can only extract so much additional power and stability before it starts to take away from the rest of your game. When paired with the right string, you'll get a well-balanced feel that's comfortable on the arm, solid on impact, but not too flexible. The feeling of the flexibility is more uniform throughout the racket, where the Blade Pro was more direct in the throat. But the characteristics of dwell time and ball pocketing didn't seem to differ too much from one another. I will say that the Ultra Pro for me does seem to feel a little bit more stiffer than the Blade Pro despite the RA ratings, but not enough to fuss over. Touch shots are overall strong points to these rackets, as they don't have any fancy technologies added to the racket, and it helps give you that very unique feel, much more harder to come by with today's tweener rackets that tend to be more muted, hollow or stiffer. Ease of use and maneuverability is one of the more standout features when you compare it to the Blade Pro. When playing offensively, you need to make sure your footwork is on point, as the racket requires optimal timing, positioning and balance to stay aggressive, which is why maintaining a nice headlight balance is highly recommended. I mean, obviously that's how you're meant to play in general, but I think it's fair and realistic to assume that it's more difficult to sustain this ball to ball as an amateur player. Although I can play just fine with the Ultra Pro and I've gotten pretty good at using it in the last 3 or 4 weeks, it's still a racket that will inevitably expose my weaknesses more often, so in serious competition my game is not going to be maximized to its fullest potential if I use a racket like this. But it is a great way for me to improve and be more conscious of my weaknesses during training sessions. On the other end of the spectrum, the Ultra Pro is easily suited to a reasonably high level player with sound footwork and technique who is looking for a modern day control racket with a diverse range of quality playing characteristics. The good news is that the slightly more open pattern does lend itself to a bit of an increase in power potential compared to the 1820 pattern, enough to make the original 1820 users content. The Blade Pro didn't have free power in comparison to the tweener rackets in today's game, but it's accessible if you knuckle down and swung through the ball with good technique. For today's standard racket, the Ultra Pro seems to have a larger emphasis on control, and it doesn't seem to be designed to hit through your opponent unless you're an extremely explosive player. Power is on the lower end in today's modern day rackets, so it's more targeted towards players who 100% self-generate. But if you're coming from an old Pro Staff 90, this will likely be more than enough for you with the extra level of forgiveness. So it's not really a complaint at all. It all boils down to how you want to play. Maybe you produce a crazy amount of power on your own and you need to tame it. Maybe you want to swing as hard as you can on every shot and have no fear of the ball sailing too far away from your target. There is a balance that this racket gives where you get a bit more juice out of it than the 1820, but far more controllable than the 1619 Blade Pro, which some may have thought of having a little bit too much power for an advanced player. There's not any type of special amount of extra spin this possesses over the 1820 model, but I would say the launch angle is what is more important, which makes it more accessible for players like me who like to hit with variety. In my warm-up and practice sessions, I typically have a much loopier and spinny ball, but when I play points, I tend to flatten out my shots a lot more, so I'd like to be able to access both of them, which is what the 1619 pattern allows me to do over the 1820. There is some level of spin that is available if you really rip through the ball, supplemented with a nice spin-friendly poly, but in general, the whole idea of creating penetrating spin with the Ultra Pro requires much more effort, and this is on top of the great amount of energy that you're already exerting into your regular shots and higher pace rally balls. You need to get to the ball on time first so you can set up properly and get your body weight through the swing. As for the slice, I found that I really enjoyed it in 2 different ways. The first being defensive slices, which are more return of serve blocks or on the run wide balls. It just seemed quite easy to get through the ball, and not that it was necessarily a ball that I was trying to rip through, but it felt very forgiving for me to get the racket to come down behind the ball, which provided enough height and depth to allow me to work my way back into some points when I was swung out wide. The second was being on balance and timing it correctly. I then had the ability to actually rip down into the ball and get a good skid into the slice. But the same principles apply as the ground strokes, and that's if you get lazy and you don't use racket head speed, the balls can tend to float sometimes. Control works differently for different categories. I'll get a lot of people who disagree with me in this regard, but ground strokes, I'm going to break it down into two different ways. Now, throughout the review, I have mentioned that the Ultra Pro is a control racket. The type of control I get from the racket is a confidence-inspiring type of control, which feels like even if I rip through the ball with a lot of racket head speed, if I use the same consistent form, technique, and rhythm as I play out a rally, I find the balls just keep landing in over and over again with a good amount of depth. I found that overall my general level of consistency was better than usual using this racket, and it has improved as I progress through the playtest. The racket works really well if you completely swing through it, or if the ball you're receiving has some pace on it. You can use an efficient half swing that's aimed at guiding the ball back into play and towards your target. Something in between seems to produce the least effective ball, but I will say the one thing that I seem to struggle with the most in my playtest was being able to paint the lines. And this is probably coming down to what I've been saying this whole time, which is basically trying to attack off a dime or play aggressively without sharply setting up your positioning. You create more variances in your shots, possibly making you spray or just not get close enough to where you need it to go. I would say the limitations are more to do with the player's skill level. So I'm not saying that it's not possible to obtain that extra level of control, but perhaps if you play like I do, both skill level and game style, then these are some of the areas that you may expect to struggle with. I suspect that someone who plays with excellent footwork and favors longer rallies will have not as many difficulties, but just from my point of view, that's where the racket kind of fails me for my particular playstyle. There's not a lot to say about serves in general, but I will say that it's not one of the better serving rackets out there, but it's not a bad one either. It provides just enough pace to be able to force some errors and get some free points, though you'll likely get easier points if you combine that with highly accurate serves instead. Kick serves are surprisingly pretty decent overall, but you do need to really come underneath the ball. You can see some of the balls which were already dead while I was playing with them still kicked up around head height for my partner. She's roughly about 1.72 meters tall. As you can see here in the clip, they're bouncing around the height that's just out of someone's comfortable hitting zone, which is probably around shoulder height or above. Slice serves also work quite well, being one of my favorite serves. You can still produce great serves with a good amount of pace, and contrary to ground strokes, you can get some pretty good pinpoint accuracy as well. Probably to do with being in full control of the serve from the get-go, unlike the ground strokes where you're always on the move. But it just means you'll have to be more precise with your technique in comparison to other great serving rackets. Stability is one of my favorite parts about this racket. I didn't feel like the stability was affected at all, even when I reduced the swing weight down to the lower levels of my different modifications. Although it didn't give me the same rock solid base as the Blade Pro, something about it, even if it felt a little bit shaky, didn't seem to badly affect my ball in any way. I found the racket very good at blocking and receiving balls at higher paces once you weight it up just enough. When you hit that sweet spot for your own preference, you'll find that you don't need anything more than the minimum amount for the racket to play effectively stable. The two standout shots were blocking and guiding balls to your target. I felt like my success rate was fairly high on returns that I had to lunge and block and absorb bigger balls. And going up in static weight and swing weight was not going to adequately compensate me to maintain the other levels of my game. It's not an overall extremely forgiving racket, but I've definitely played with ones that are far more difficult. Since you still have the advantage of maneuverability, the forgiveness in terms of hitting the sweet spot is not too small. Playing with tighter 1820s and smaller head sizes than 97 square inches will typically be less manageable. It's more to do with needing excellent footwork to optimize your play. That is what makes the racket more difficult to play with, since you need your body weight and full swing to produce an effective ball. But the sweet spot size is around the low to mid-range level, something you would really expect normally from when you play with an advanced style racket. Keeping the Ultra Pro with the same balance point as stock form is a real key to sustaining a well-rounded racket. Volleys are easy to come around, and coupled with the borderline perfect amount of stability, you'll find that volleys will be much easier to manage than the Blade Pro. It's a great racket for doubles for managing reflex volleys, touch volleys, and drop volleys. The Ultra Pro feel is probably a little bit more susceptible to firmer strings than the H19, so in that aspect you may not get the same level of flex or comfort that you do in the Ultra Pro as you would in the H19. If you're already playing with stiffer strings, my guess is that you're probably not that sensitive to stiffer rackets anyway. Know that when paired with the correct string, I have even found that I preferred the feel of the Ultra Pro over the H19, so there are plenty of options for you to experiment with and get the most out of it. The Ultra Pro 1619 is not particularly a master of any particular category, rather it performs in a very well balanced manner throughout each aspect and has no glaring weakness. If there was a true way to define the racket in my personal opinion, I would say it is probably the most accurate racket that plays one-to-one with your own abilities. In my mind, there are two types of players who truly benefit from using this particular racket, and this is actually convenient that the two players on tour who use this racket play with these game styles. One of them would be the hyper-aggressive player with monstrous power that needs to be controlled, whom is Madison Keys, and the other is a complete all-court player with excellent speed and footwork who does not mind defending, attacking, coming into the net, or occasionally blasting the winner, and that would be Gael Monfils. Does this exactly complement my game in any way when I play a serious match? Probably not, but does it help me improve my game and make me more aware of my weaknesses? Then absolutely yes. Out of the two rackets, the Blade Pro is more suitable to my game style, being able to generate big serves and more penetrating shots through spin and power from the baseline. But neither of the rackets are better than one another. My rating that I'll give it in the end is more predicated towards my style of play, but for anyone else, the ratings could be reversed or much higher in any given category. Once again, that wraps up my review. If you've made it here, thank you for staying throughout the whole video. The next couple videos will be likely the final collection to the Pro Labs line, which is the 6195 or the Pro Staff 97. As always, appreciate your time for sticking around. I'll catch you guys in the next video.